You may well ask, why didn't you just buy the Hornby or Bachmann version? Well, I think somebody's trolling me. This one just fell through the letterbox one day last year. No letter, no explanation. It's not the sort of thing I'd normally build, but hey ho, let's give it a go. Out of the packet it comes with 3 sprues, 2 of which are the same, holding each side of the side frames and the other one holding the deck and the box. The first thing I did after I read the instructions was to drill out the axle boxes to hold a pinpoint bearing. The side frame moulding is quite thin, so I elected to do this while it was still attached to the sprue, with my finger behind it so I could feel when the drill was about to pop through but didn't quite. That was with a 2mm drill, and then with a 6mm bit I just twisted it with my fingers just to give a chamfered edge to the hole, take off all the swarfy bits. You'll have seen me do this before, but it's really important on this kit. Some manufacturers of the brass bearing cups leave a little nipple on the top, and that definitely needs to come off on this kit. And then once it's pressed into place, we can start cutting stuff out and gluing stuff together. Construction is fairly easy. It's only literally 5 parts, 2 sides, 2 ends and a top. Although saying that, most of it was done by eye because there's very few locating lugs. Because most modelling benches aren't exactly dead flat, I used my bending tool as a flat surface to get the floor and chassis sides together. Again, eyeing in the wheel sets to make sure everything was square, and gluing in place with extra thin cement. I use this because it's a little less harsh than the normal stuff that I use, and it doesn't take away the details so much. Once one side frame was virtually set, I then put the other set in with one wheel set and then held that firm until it was setting, inserted the other wheel and then glued up. Using the bending tool as a flat surface again, I took any twist out of the wagon by putting it on and making sure that all the wheels were touching. You can see this by shining a light behind it, and when there's no gap it becomes very obvious. Leaving it overnight so that the glue can cure completely, it was the next day when I started adding the details like the headstocks, the brake gear. Before I started adding detail, I hit the books and did quite a lot of research into the thing that I was actually building, just to make sure I was right, or more not wrong. A thing that became quite apparent while I was building this kit, that it's going to end up being quite light, so I decided to try and pack as much weight into it as possible. I glued a couple of strips of evergreen styrene strip on the underside of the chassis. This helped to stiffen the chassis up a little bit, and created a channel where I could drop in a couple of lead weights, and then a few other bits of plasticard on top to keep them housed in, which also acted as a base for the couplings that I was going to put on at a later stage. Now, taking a step backwards for a minute and just addressing the fact that Hornby and Bachmann have produced this vehicle. They both produced the Great Western version, which had the ratchet handbrake. I'm doing the one that's got the Morton brake gear on it, so it's got a lever handbrake, which is different and makes it worthwhile building the kit. These wagons, or technically Shunters trucks, were first introduced by the Great Western in 1895, 120 years ago, being classified M1. Subsequent builds were classified as M2, M3, M4 and M5. This kit covers the versions M4 and M5, but I'm sure with a few extra spare parts and things accumulated off of other kits, it would be quite easy to or derate it or modify it into one of the earlier versions. 309 of these vehicles were built over the years, the majority of them to the first diagram M1. All of the details that I'm reading will be linked in the description below, along with a couple of links to websites where I found all this information. Reading between the lines, it appears that British Railways built 3 of these vehicles. 2, I suspect, were from previous Great Western orders, but fulfilled by British Railways, therefore having Great Western numbers. Only one, DB 997-900, was officially sanctioned by British Railways, and being the only one to receive a British Railways number. We'll talk more about that later, because this is the vehicle that I'm basing mine on. Now, however long it took me to get the build this far, it then took me that long again to get the handrails on. And in doing so, I glued my fingers together twice, it snapped off once, and I even swore. And then again, when I didn't record it, mainly because the camera kept getting in the way. However, once they were on, it was into the sink for a quick wash, and then into the spray booth for a quick coat of not black, that will be Revel number 9 charcoal. I gave it 2 thin coats and it didn't cover completely, but then I wasn't worried because all I needed it to do was act as like a base coat in readiness for the steps that were to come. The handrails were painted white, and then I left it for the paint to harden off for at least 24 hours. Now from this point on, this video should be called Winging It, because I have no clue what I'm doing here. Painting wood to get a wood effect, I've never done it before, so this is, it's also a cue for any of you out there that don't know how to do it. Just pick up a paintbrush and start spreading paint about, see what happens. And that is because I assume, because there's literally no photographs of the deck of these sort of wagons, that it should be just unpainted wood. I'm sure it should be treated in some sort of way. So the first two coats were a brown and then mixed with an off-white colour to give that sort of old wood sort of colour effect. Next was a thin coat of light grey. It looks quite white on the camera, but it's actually light grey, and it's really thin, so I thinned it down quite a lot so that everything else that underneath it should show through. Then to finish off, it was back to the original brown and off-white mixed together and thinned down, and then just spread liberally over the top again so that everything else underneath should show through just a little bit. The last step, well, with paint-based materials anyway, was to give it a panel wash, so just to pick out all the individual planks. Rather than mop up the excess this time though, I decided just to blend it in with a little bit of thinners. It would have probably looked better if I'd have noticed that the camera had focused on the box instead of the planks. Now, it's not very often I use my modeller's license, but on this one I decided to exercise my right. There's no hard evidence that any of them received a TOPS code, but for my purposes I'm going to use it. ZSP is the code that this one had, because it was through vacuum piped. A selection of Fox transfers that I've got on stock were used and affixed with Humbrol decal fix. Once the decals were dried, I then went about weathering the tool equipment box and the rest of the side frames with a dry brush loaded with light grey. The corners of the equipment box are metal, and I decided to give it a quick coat of Humbrol Metal Coat 27003. Let it dry overnight and then polish it up to expose the metal flake with a cotton bud. Weathering powders next, and I only used 3: track rust, medium rust and black. applied liberally with a medium soft brush, and then once it's all stuck on a little bit, it was then going in with a finer brush to blend it all in. That was the chassis and the running gear, and then for the deck I used what had been brushed off on my paper towel and then just spread it liberally onto the deck. If only the camera would focus on the part that I wanted it to. When I'd finished, or more to the point, when I got bored of spreading pigments about, I then fixed it in place by putting the pigment fixer through the airbrush and just misting it on at a very, very low pressure. I'd removed the wheels to do the bulk of the weathering, and when I went to put them back I had a bit of a dippy moment because I'd forgotten that I'd used Humbrol Maskell to mask out the brass bearing cups. Once I'd come to my senses and sorted it all out, a little drop of oil in each of the cups, replacing the wheels, and I'm pretty happy with the way it's turned out, and I'm calling it job done. This video's gone on long enough as it is, so I'll leave the justification of how an Eastern Region diesel man can justify having a steam era Great Western wagon on his railway. We'll leave that for another video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.